Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. Hey, it's Alex Williams here at South by Southwest. Had the good fortune to have lunch with these two founders of the company Netlify. Hi guys, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Great, good to meet you.
Why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Great. Now we were just kind of having a little chat, and you guys, I'm interested in your platform. If you could help us just explain it quickly. And I'd like to learn a little bit about your guys' background.
Absolutely.
So we're both from Denmark originally, but I spent 7 years in Madrid in Spain before coming to the Bay Area in San Francisco. And there I worked as CTO for a company that built websites for small to medium businesses, but at a very large scale. So we would build 100 websites a week, tens of thousands of sites total. It had network of freelance designers and then in-house sales team, project management team, 20 plus people tech team that built the whole platform that the designers would do the design on, the clients would use for content management, and that ran every project from brief to production website. And then based on that, I started a company called WebPop, which was really taking that kind of platform and then building a cloud-hosted CMS for other agencies and professionals that they could use to get some of the same efficiencies in their workflow. Came to the Bay Area with that, and then started noticing the way front-end developers and web developers work just fundamentally change. When I started WebPop, the number one feature request without any comparison was FTP access, which today is why would you even want an FTP, right? What is it even? Git became this massive phenomenon, not just for version control, but also as the way developers interact and share their ideas and publish even, right? And the browser became so much more powerful than it had been before. All these microservices you could call directly from the browser started emerging.
Right.
And front-end build tools also completely changed how front-end developers worked.
Right.
So based on that, I saw this new architecture for the web emerging and built a small MVP in that space called BitBalloon, which was really just you could drop a front-end folder into bitballoon.com and it would be live in a few seconds. Got enough traction with that I could sort of validate that this was something that was happening. And then at that point, I reached out to Chris, who I've known for more than 20 years.
Yeah, we go way back. I knew each other in high school.
Yeah.
Back then we would drink a lot of beer and visit the jazz club circuit, right? We thought we were going to do a jazz club together, but
Oh, really?
Yes.
but then we found out that the economics of that is pretty detrimental, right? So,
Yeah.
So I took a different career path. I have a lifetime ago I was in film. I did a digital agency that specialized in video and flash and stuff like that. Saw some success with that and sold it to a full service agency where, as part of that merger, I became their chief digital officer. And that's where I was really sort of struggling with the legacy stack without really knowing I just thought it was the premise of doing web, right?
Right.
I mean, whether we're doing small mobile landing pages that picks up QR scans in a local supermarket and all the way up to large enterprise sites, the fact that 20 years ago, basically, we all figured out that instead of doing these static websites, we could make an application that would run all the time.
Right.
And that would ensure that you serve the contemporary version of the site every time, so you could read each other's comments even though you came in with a few seconds in between, and basically the social internet was born, right? Web 2.0. But what we saw was that it led to these monolithic apps.
Right.
And the issues with that have just kept scaling, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a performance point of view, when Steve Jobs came out with the iPhone and talked of HTML5 and the promise of web apps, and then had to go with a native silo, right, of apps that they probably have it with today, but it also meant that the web just wasn't performant enough, right? Security issues, malware has become a $100 billion industry, right? It's a big pain point that we have a surface area of attack that is exposed all the time. And lastly, scalability. I mean, anyone that has sat at an agency or anywhere else, and you have to sort of figure out how we're going to serve this website, and then you're guessing at peak traffic and trying to cater that, because everyone else, go to
Which
Hacker
is a
News,
very
right?
much of a legacy architecture mindset.
Exactly, right? And so what we saw was just Matt was sort of also saying, hey, the front end revolution is happening, right? I used to have front enders hired that cut out PSDs, converted them into HTML and send them off for implementation. Today they're using advanced markup, build tools, all these fantastic things, right? And it's a very much a Git-centric workflow that has changed the name of the game.
Yes.
And the other hand, we saw, and already before we started, microservices was something that was happening to an extent that 90+% of anything that needed real-time updating had already been abstracted out to the browser. So you had a monolithic app, but no one would build their own payment gateway. You just connect to payment or Stripe, right?
Right.
You want comments, you use Discuss or Facebook comments or whatever. So this architecture of having a very powerful browser that connects to microservices, and then you have a monolithic app that still runs for just basically serving the shell of the website didn't make any sense anymore, right?
No.
So we wanted to cater a workflow where you could essentially just have a static front end that had multiple points of origin, cut out the single server altogether, and then only talk to microservices whenever needed from the browser.
So you could then essentially use the so how does that quicken things? Like, I'm thinking about like separating that presentation layer, right, from the back end, right?
Right.
So you can how does the incremental update happen so like it is replicated and it's universal, so you have that update that's consistent?
Yeah, that's something that we had to put a lot of work into, right? Because if you do this in a naive way, let's say you adopt a build tool like Gatsby or Hugo or something like that, and you build out your site, and then you make a change in a sidebar, and that essentially changes every single HTML page, right? Or you add a new category, and that changes the sidebar in every single page and links to that new category. If you just naively upload that to S3, for example, right? Like then every time you have a deploy like that, you'll have this unknown period of time where your site is in an inconsistent state, where people might get broken links and they might get like one design on one page view and another and another, and it's just not like, that's fine if it's a developer blog, but it's not okay if it's like a professional.com or a magazine or anything, right? So we had to put a lot of work into building our own custom content delivery network geared to small files, where most content delivery networks have traditionally solved for serving large video assets and stuff like that, right? We wanted to serve the actual HTML files very fast, and then with the ability to do atomic deploys across the entire CDN with instant cache invalidation, right?
Okay, so the instant caching validation that you...
So instant cache invalidation is part of it, right? But you also have to be like, even if you did the instant cache invalidation with an S3 bucket or something, just not knowing what the bucket state is would mean that you couldn't guarantee consistency, because some uncached hits might go through and get cached at the wrong time and so on, right? So you also need to solve sort of at the level of where does that CDN fetch from and when does it fetch? How can you guarantee that it's always getting the right thing to the user? And that took a lot of work. Our CTO recently did a Medium post around how we use Merkle trees internally to we've sort of built out our own large distributed Git-like file system that allows us to keep these snapshots of consistent state and so on.
So it's those snapshots of consistent stages that you can use almost as like keep them on a shelf in a way.
Yeah, and we can essentially keep essentially it's like thinking of having a pointer that points to like, this is the version of the site that's live now, and then you just move the pointer, trigger the cache invalidation at the same time, right? And instantly you have the next version live and consistent.
So that's a resource-driven methodology, isn't it? I mean, in some respects, I mean, you're thinking about that cache, and you've got to think carefully about that cache and how you're...
Yeah, so one of the interesting things with that, right, is also this, like, when you talk, for example, of something like static sites, right? Like in reality, that's not about like files being read off a server somewhere. In reality, that's about a certain cache guarantee. Like, because if you have, let's say you have a WordPress site and you put a CDN that can do instant cache invalidation in front of it, you still don't have any cache guarantee for like when does things actually change in concert, right? Like every single WordPress template is a Turing complete program that can do anything, right? So you don't have any way of saying like this is guaranteed to be when it changes, right? So once people start working with that architecture, caching becomes extremely hard and very demanding on the developers.
Yeah.
Whereas we could say like, our approach in general is that we are completely agnostic about what tools and what frameworks and so on do people use, but we're extremely opinionated about the architecture, right?
Yeah.
And the architecture is partly this cache guarantee that you're never gonna have content that's rendered on the fly by a server talking to a database. Like you're going to have a build process that says like now the new version is ready, and then you're going to do a release of that essentially, right? And once you buy into that architecture, then we can give you a workflow around it that's just completely automated and where you don't have to think at all about caching or cache invalidation or anything, because we can automate that for you.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, going back out a little bit up into the helicopter, right? Like the reasoning for doing this as well is also just because if you take a circle around, the microservices in the front end and the Git-centric workflow, what was the promise of it really, right? Is to build websites and web properties in a way where you have much more performance, you're never waiting for anything to build, and you can have multiple points of origin, because a CDN no longer becomes something you put in front of it. If you build it right, you can have your site directly on the CDN, right? One. Number two, there's no server-server attack. There's no movable parts. You still have your microservices, but they're smaller, they're much more obscure, and you had them to a great extent anyway, right? I mean, because this is how people are using, they are building out web properties, even if they have monolithic apps to do it, right?
So how, okay.
And then, of course, the scalability. When you don't have to build something every time you have a visitor, it doesn't really matter if you have 1 million visitors, right? So it became way more scalable, right? But you had something like that, where it's just faster, safer, and cheaper to an extent where we were like, why isn't everyone doing this, right?
But what are the trade-offs? What are the trade-offs that you guys have to make?
Well, they weren't. That was exactly, we were looking at it, right? And the trade-offs were there was no viable workflows. The trade-offs is you have something that's faster, safer, and cheaper, right? Like everyone would be doing it. The problem is there was a lack of an ecosystem, but very much also, so when we dogfooded this in the beginning, there was this way of saying, okay, I have an infrastructure that's not catered to this, right? Because CDNs is made for big files and hostings, services for hosting something with running code, right? And once you took the web host out of it and only had static files, it was sort of very limited what you could do. At the same time, you needed stuff like continuous deployment as a separate service built, right? If you have a single page app, you need pre-rendering, you had all these shell scripts running in your server. There's just so many things that you had to do, and they weren't aware of each other. So you had to sort of make them aware, right? And that meant that, and this was mimicked in the market as well, where you had the best developers in the world starting to build this way, but they were building prototypes and sandboxing, right? Or their own blog. Or they were Harper Reed cherry-picking 20 engineers and building out the Obama campaign, right? It's a very famous early example of this, but what about everyone in between that could benefit so tremendously from having infrastructure that would scale so much better? They weren't doing it, and it was because there was no viable workflow. So Netlify was born out of this. We have a big custom infrastructure because it didn't exist. We needed to build out a virtual CDN that catered the small files, that could give you that atomic deploy, instant cache validation, high cacheability that Matt talks about, because nothing like that existed, but it was a means to an end. And the end is developer workflows on top of it. The way where you have one click and you get HTTPS and custom domain and continuous integration into Git, and a site where every single file is validated and looked at what caching, addressing, header should this have, and so on, right?
So with this server-side approach, the architecture you've built underneath it, how are you, this becomes kind of a very complex mechanism that has multiple, parts to it. You're talking about microservices here, aren't you? And you were saying before that underneath you're building on the Kubernetes architecture. I'm curious about your decision making.
Yeah, we have obviously one of the trade-offs is that we have to build a very large, complex infrastructure to make this extremely easy and straightforward for our users, right? Yeah. But obviously we get the joy of dealing with a very large multi-cloud infrastructure spread around. Like right now, we have points of presence in Rackspace, DigitalOcean, AWS, Google Compute, Alibaba, Azure, and Host Virtual, I think, right? And run a really complex distributed system across that. And we sort of have different layers. Like the CDN layer itself, we have to be very close to the networking stack. So there it's all about like C++ binaries and an efficient infrastructure automation for simply like spinning up a new CDN pop anywhere, having it automatically added to our DNS-based traffic director and so on. Then our whole build infrastructure, there it's where initially we were doing like managing Docker containers ourselves, and now we've adopted Kubernetes as the scheduler and everything, right? That essentially gives us the system to say like schedule these 15 builds now and make sure there's enough machines to build it, use these Docker images and so on.
So how are you using Lambda? You're mentioning you're using Lambda as well, kind of in this environment.
Yeah. So that's a new thing we're launching that we're extremely excited about. Like one of the things you start seeing once you start using these microservices from the front end, and you have a lot of ready-made services all out there that's already been built. You maybe have some of your own. Very often, you need some glue code to tie them together, right? Like just like a canonical example is something as simple as using Stripe checkout for payment, right? Like they give you almost everything, but you still need some little bit of server-side glue code to take the secret API key and sign a request to Stripe, right? And now suddenly, just because of these like 5 lines of code, you have to set up a server somewhere and run a different deployment process and figure out like how do you deploy it in when you make changes to that, how do you coordinate that with your front end and with your staging environments, and suddenly you just like multiplied the complexity of everything, right? So what we are doing is saying just like we can roll out your front end as an atomic deploy instantly after a build, we let you say this is a folder where I have AWS Lambda functions, and every time you do a build, we'll roll those out together with your front end in the same atomic deploy as immutable functions, and we'll set out the routing and everything.
So from your perspective as a chief digital officer, what are you dreaming of here?
Well, I think the beautiful thing is that once you use microservices, right, as Matt says, sometimes you have something where it just makes, it's so little code, it makes no sense to make a microservice spin up a server, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's why the promise of functions right now is spreading like wildfire everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And everyone's coming out with functions. So for us, it was the idea, we did not want to do functions ourselves. There's no Netlify functions. So we're accommodating Lambda functions, right? But the reality is that there's a vast majority of developers, if you go to Lambda, it's really hardcore, right? And even if you make it work, it's right out here. It's not part of the process. So this way, not only makes it simpler, but actually just gives a folder. You put your code in there, your function code, and that's it, right? Everything is authenticated, run for you, and it basically brings it back in to your front end without being a back end, right? So that's the promise of functions, right? It's server-side code without a server. And of course it has limitations, but once you meet them, that's because you want to build a microservice anyway, or use third-party applications, right?
Yeah, well, we look forward to hearing more from you guys. The server-side story is the one that we're really starting to follow. Yeah. We're starting to see the infrastructure software that has been really baked out, I think, over the past few years, starting to really have that be a resource for really these event-driven automated environments that really speak to more automation on the front end, which I think you guys are really exemplifying.
Yeah, I mean, we want to enable the front end. You know, we talk about a warning of a change of nomenclature, that there is no front end, and there's just web developers by now, right? And every step we take is to empower that, right?
Terrific.
To have web developers being able to compartmentalize everything for the sake of efficiency, right? But also having accessibility to making all of these things, so you don't send them off into the gap, across the gap towards implementation somewhere else, right? Well,
Christian and Matthias, two long time friends from the days of Denmark and via Barcelona, and then I'm sure all kinds of other places in between. Congratulations for making it to Austin. And,
thanks for having us, man.
And next steps beyond.
All right, cheers, buddy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.